For over 100 years, educators and policymakers have fought a bitter, unresolved war over how to organize a classroom. Specifically, they argue over whether to separate students based on their perceived academic abilities, a practice known as tracking. The logic behind the practice is straightforward. By dividing a school into distinct ability groups, teachers can bypass a broad curriculum and tailor their instruction to match the specific pace and needs of the students directly in front of them. This chart shows student achievement plotted over a high school timeline, based on data collected by Adam Gammaren and Robert Marr. Instead of moving in parallel across high school, the trajectories of high-track and low-track students starkly diverge. We see an acceleration of inequality, the Matthew effect in action. The students placed in high tracks compound their academic advantages, while those assigned to low tracks actively lose ground the longer they remain in the system. This data fracture created two warring camps. On one side, advocates like Jeannie Oakes demand the total elimination of tracking to stop the widening achievement gap. On the other, researchers like Tom Lovelace and Beth Rubin document how schools that attempt to detrack often experience a collapse in instructional quality and widespread teacher burnout. We possess a century of data, millions of transcripts, and thousands of localized studies. Yet neither side can decisively prove their method works universally across all school systems. The problem is not a lack of data. The bottleneck lies in epistemology. We are hitting the limits of the philosophical rules that govern how social scientists define a fact. To finally understand why the tracking debate remains gridlocked, we have to look past the classroom and examine the architecture of scientific methodology itself, tracing the evolution from positivism to post-positivism. Modern social science is built on empiricism, the premise that true knowledge only comes from objective sensory experience and observation. This traces back to philosophers like John Locke, who argued that the human mind begins as a blank slate, entirely furnished by its physical interaction with the external world. David Hume expanded this by arguing that knowledge is constructed through the accumulation of repeated patterns. If you observe one event regularly following another, you can begin to outline a scientific law. In the 19th century, Auguste Comte took Hume's observation of patterns and formalized it into positivism. Comte believed human behavior could be measured, predicted, and governed by immutable laws, exactly like physics or chemistry. This shows the ideal positivist framework, a rigid, linear system where an isolated cause produces a measurable effect. Applying this to tracking in the 1980s, researchers like Alan Kirchhoff hunted for a universal law. Structuring studies to prove track level directly causes the achievement gap. Forcing a positivist lens onto a school environment requires treating a classroom like a sterile vacuum, hunting for rigid laws of physics in a highly volatile human space. That search for a universal law broke down against a methodological crisis known as selectivity bias. Students in high and low tracks arrive with vastly different pre-existing conditions. It becomes mathematically nearly impossible to prove if the assigned track caused the poor test outcome, or if a student's socioeconomic background dictated their placement in the low track to begin with. To correct this bias, researchers used endogenous switching regressions, advanced models mapping competing probability distributions simultaneously. Yet, even with strict controls, unobserved variables like English proficiency, social class, and student effort actively scramble their intersection. Positivism relies on an objective, clean boundary between the researcher, the environment, and the subject being measured. Classrooms are heavily contaminated by human context. The search for a clean, immutable law of tracking failed because the subjects being measured were inextricably tied to the environments shaping them. This failure forced a methodological upgrade, pioneered by philosopher Karl Popper and the post-positivist movement. Popper argued that you can never fully verify a universal scientific law, no matter how much data you collect. You can only falsify it. Finding 10,000 white swans doesn't prove all swans are white. To test the positivist claim that tracking universally harms students and creates inequality, we don't look for more confirmation, we look for a black swan. Popper proposed situational analysis. Instead of hunting universal laws, researchers must evaluate behavior based on the specific, localized rules and resources of a given environment. Mapping international data reveals anomalies. In Taiwan, a differentiated tracking system with high-stakes exams for low-track students actually reduced inequality as academic incentives remained high. Similarly, Israeli schools using multiple ability levels in math produced less inequality than single-level schools. Even within the United States, Catholic schools exhibit significantly smaller achievement gaps between tracks than public schools, simply by placing higher academic demands on the students assigned to lower levels. These international and institutional anomalies successfully falsify the positivist law. They prove that tracking doesn't automatically dictate inequality. The outcomes are governed by situational instructional quality and standards, not an absolute structural rule. If the data shows that context matters more than structure, we have to ask why the American educational system remains locked in a bitter debate over simply keeping or killing the tracking structure. Philosopher Thomas Kuhn provides the answer through his theory of paradigms. Kuhn identified normal science as the entrenched methods and accepted practices of any professional community. A community relies on these standard procedures to function, making them highly resistant to outside disruption. Forcing teachers to move from rigidly tracked classrooms to mixed ability settings is not a minor policy tweak. It requires rewriting the technical classroom norms that teachers have followed for generations. This explains the high failure rate of detracking efforts. When researchers examine mixed ability classrooms, they find teachers struggling to engage students at vastly different achievement levels simultaneously. The curriculum is often diluted to a manageable middle ground, leaving high achievers bored and low achievers unsupported. This diagram illustrates the technical requirements in successful detracking efforts documented by Carol Burris. To make mixed ability classrooms function without sacrificing achievement, schools deploy massive supplementary resources, accelerated curricula, strict class size limits, and intensive daily tutoring workshops for struggling students. Detracking breaks down when administrators treat it as a simple structural switch. They change the roster but ignore the specific technical requirements for teaching students at varying levels of achievement. Breaking this deadlock requires a shift toward critical realism, a framework proposed by Roy Bhaskar that separates social structures from the biological reality of learning. Bhaskar divided knowledge into two categories. The first is intransitive knowledge. These are the physical realities and processes that exist entirely independent of human theory. The biological mechanics of a student's brain forming a new neural connection as they learn algebra is an intransitive reality. The second category is transitive knowledge. These are the human-constructed theories, curriculum boards, policies, and tracking structures layered on top of that biological reality. This exposes the core flaw in a century of educational debate. Researchers and politicians have spent decades treating tracking, a transitive social construct, as if it were an intransitive law of nature. The research suggests that tracking is not a universal structural law. Instead, it is a transitive tool, an artificial layer that succeeds or fails based on the quality of instruction beneath it. True progress in educational policy demands abandoning the positivist search for universal one-size-fits-all solutions and embracing the rigorous, context-dependent reality of the post-positivist world.